Hello, and welcome to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week, we looked at Jojo's bizarre adventure, Phantom Blood. Phantom Blood is a delicious recipe consisting of a Victorian melodrama base, a dash of classic rock, a generous heaping of Mr. Universe contestants, a splash of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and a fine crust of Old Yeller.
Put it together and it results in the spiciest meatball.
It is a meatball pie, I guess. Kind of lost the plot on that one. We'll roll with it. Yes, we watched JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the first 9 episodes of it. This was an anime that I had heard a lot about just because it is very prevalent in the community, and basically anyone who watches anime will tell you to go watch the show. I went in pretty much entirely blind, which, like a lot of the things that we talk about here, is the best way to do it because it kicks you in the nuts right quick and you're not expecting it. I really like the show, or at least I should hedge this by saying I've seen the first 9 episodes. I really like those episodes. I started to watch the rest of it and I could not get into it as much. It turns very heavily standard shonen in a way, and I've seen parts of the other stuff and I like those parts, but I can't sit down and bring myself to watch like 45 episodes of dudes fighting. I have things I need to do. Sorry, not sorry. But if you want like 9 episodes of pure unbridled mayhem and joy and insanity, go watch Phantom Blood. It's absurd but delicious.
Speaking of the rest of those episodes, the 50 episodes of dudes fighting, as you say, I am the resident JoJo fan here, I guess you would say. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this series. I love it to death and also hate it for the same reason, in that it's completely insane and off the wall, and Hirohiko Araki, the author, makes a lot of inspired choices. So it's kind of funny that even though I'm definitely the bigger JoJo fan here, it was actually Sean who introduced me to it by telling me all about just the weirdness that happens in these first 9 episodes in this first part. Also, funnily enough, I am the opposite on the rest of the first season, on part 2, Battle Tendency. That's my favorite part in the whole series by far. But, you know, that's kind of a whole other thing. But just with the context of being a JoJo fan, it makes you look at part 1 a little bit differently, because it shows you that there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on there, but it also, I feel like, has kind of the growing pains of an author who wants to do this weird thing, and has a neat idea with some cool concepts as well as some like really wacky out there ones in mind, but just doesn't quite have the skill to really make totally good on those concepts yet. With that said, I actually enjoyed Phantom Blood more the second time when I came back to it. The first time I almost gave up on it about the middle part. I really liked the first 3 episodes where it's kind of establishing that rivalry between the first JoJo, Jonathan Joestar, and Dio.
Our main antagonist, just so that it's clear if you haven't watched the show.
Yes. Our main bad boy, Dio. And so I really enjoyed those episodes. It loses me a little bit in the middle because for some of the same reason that I think Sean's not into part 2 as much, I think it leans a little too closely to the shonen tropes. Maybe even a little closer than Battle Tendency does it sometimes.
Yeah, I very much agree with him that it does slow down in the middle. Even watching this, like the first time, I remember getting really bogged down and feeling tired watching it. I kind of ended up in the same place, but you just got to trust us and power through. Like, there's probably an episode worth of just kind of a slog, but it's worth it to get it through on the other end.
Yeah, even in those episodes that are a little slower, a little less exciting, there's still plenty of fun stuff to take you through. I think it very much rewards a second watch, especially when you take into consideration that this is very much the beginning of like a whole saga. Because JoJo's been running for like 20 years. It's up to like part 8 right now. And I think as far as with that context, it does a lot of interesting things. And as a story unto itself, I think the last episode is also very satisfying. So if nothing else, it kind of brings it home in a way that rewards you if you started to lose it when maybe they're just running around doing some fighting and yelling. Because the other thing about this episode is that regarding the fighting and yelling, that's definitely, I think, the place where the growing pains are happening most. You can see, because JoJo's style of combat is, in the later parts anyway, I'd say, like, starting with part 2, definitely in part 3, known for being a little bit more, I kind of want to say cerebral, and I kind of don't. It's kind of weird to describe a series like JoJo as cerebral, but the fighting is very different in later parts from something like Dragon Ball Z, which is kind of like about the spectacle of like power levels, like the earth shaking, like people punching each other. JoJo is a lot more about like people have like weird powers, and they the protagonists have to use like specific like tactics to overcome it, and you see shades of that here in the action sequences of Phantom Blood, but not enough of it, I feel like, to keep the action as interesting. A lot of the times it just kind of boils down to Jonathan shouting and punching someone, which is a little less satisfying.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with what you're saying. As I said, I have seen bits and pieces of the second and starting on the third because they're on Toonami on Adult Swim, and occasionally I'm up late enough to watch them. I'm like a 45-year-old apparently who goes to bed at 11:30. But I have really liked those parts that I saw. They were very fun, and as you were saying, the combat is much more cerebral is a good word for it. It's a lot of planning and working around adversity. So it's much more, I did this and I'm 3 steps ahead, and it's very weirdly enjoyable for him to be like, haha, you've already lost. As opposed to Phantom Blood, where it's a lot of just, I punched you in the face so hard, but it didn't damage you. Why not? Aha, you've already been frozen twice, so your third attack doesn't damage me.
Yeah, and the other thing Phantom Blood does that's pretty annoying, Battle Tendency does it a little bit too, and I think part of this is due to being an animation like adaptation, because I think in the manga, like as kind of a panel by panel, still a visual medium but more static medium, I guess, often having narration can maybe be helpful in kind of helping you follow what's exactly going on. And Battle Tendency, I think, makes the narration a little more exciting. There's a lot more of that trickster element to it. But in Phantom Blood, which is otherwise like a very good adaptation, I would say. Like the budget shows, like this, they didn't have quite the budget for this as they did for the other parts, and it shows sometimes. But I think overall, it's done with a lot of style. The way they use like color and like all the wacky poses, it's got everything that you would want. But I think just, even though it's mostly a good adaptation, kind of what you can't get around with, because it's also super faithful, is kind of including all that dialogue, and in like a medium, in the medium of animation where it's easier to tell like what's happening and why a lot of the time, having that narration just kind of bogs you down. Especially when, again, it so often just boils down to, like, Jonathan has the willpower to, like, punch a guy now. Harder. Yeah, exactly.
His punches through the power of friendship are now 3 times as hard. And his heart has grown 4 sizes that day, and he brought the presents back to Whoville. And he's great. He's the best. We love him.
Jonathan's such a good boy.
He's the best boy. He does such a good job. So, with our admission of Jonathan being our favorite boy,
he's not my favorite boy. I wanna, because okay, that's getting into some hot, like, which JoJo is the best boy is some hot debate territory. And all
right. I'm sorry. I've overstepped my bounds. I meant to say, with our admission of an high liking for Jojo. Is that acceptable? Am I okay
Jonathan's
with that
a good boy. Jonathan's a good boy.
Okay. Jonathan's a good boy. Let's talk about Jonathan. Let's call spoilers. So if you haven't seen this yet, go watch it. If you don't care, we're going to start talking spoilers. Let's open up discussing the first, episode and a half and set some scenes and talk about what that does. Specifically, let's open with the opening, the best place to start, which is a man impaled on a log or a rock or something sharp. This really does a nice job of kind of showing a lot of viscera and intent behind what is coming up. And that is important because there's a very drastic tone shift in about 3 minutes. But it's a nice foreshadowing.
Yeah, I really love this opening a lot. Like, it puts, I think, Phantom Blood in... It helps it keep up with a lot of the other more smoothed out parts, just because I love how really ruthlessly efficient these first couple episodes are. They've got a good pace to them. They've got a good arc to them. They do a good job of developing characters who aren't necessarily super complicated, but nonetheless have their own little quirks, and it does a good job of kind of establishing motivations in a very short period of time. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this, but Super Eyepatch Wolf on YouTube actually did a great video on Phantom Blood going exactly more into that, and I'm going to be drawing quite a bit from what he said. But as far as this opening goes, I really like it just as far as setting the mood. And that's really... And it does that in addition to kind of the other nuts and bolts character stuff, because this is where Jonathan's dad thinks that he's having his life saved by Dio's father, who is actually kind of attempting to rob him when he thinks that he's dead, and he's coming to kind of pilfer the coins because Jonathan's a rich noble, or George I guess is his dad's name. So in addition to kind of just setting up the beginning of that relationship, kind of the whole rainy mood, the crying baby, the really ugliness of Dario, of Dio's father, and his kind of wheezy cackles, he rummages through things. It's got a very classic gothic look to it, especially kind of when he gets a peek at the mask that'll serve as kind of the driving point of the story. And just the gore that you get instantly with that driver. Jonathan's mom is also killed in this crash, and you don't really see her, but with that initial shot of the driver, it's something that sticks with you because the show will go on to have a lot of those kind of gothic horror overtones, but it won't be doing that for a little while. So while you're sort of seeing kind of this rich boy family melodrama play out, that image, specifically of death, but also just everything else in general, is kind of hanging over your over your mind, and putting you a little bit at unease for what's going to come later.
Especially because the next scene, as you intoned, is very much rich boy melodrama. The probably next 20 minutes is aggressively rich boy melodrama, and I don't mean in your face. I mean it's super aggressive, but it's still rich boy melodrama. It's very well lit. It's very bright. It's very friendly looking. It's an antithesis of what we see in the beginning. It is much, as I said, it's brightly lit. It's happy. Everything is great. Jojo is grown up and is a happy, unknown age individual who is living his best life and enjoying everything he has. He's got his little dog friend who he loves very much. He has this girl who he's kind of getting a little bit of a something going with. He's got a great father. It's all happy. He's missing his mom, but it's not bringing him down. Then Dio shows up.
Enter Dio, one one of my favorite villains. He is just such a piece of shit, but I love him so much. And what I love so much about Dio, especially in these opening moments, is he's a piece of shit, and he's not sympathetic. He's not like a villain you're expected to cry for. But you still understand him. And a lot of that comes, as you say, like when we see those first, really it's like more like the first like 5 minutes until Dio shows up and things get bad again. But like, again, as you say, everything's really well lit. Everything's really cheery. Jonathan's dad is scolding him because he's not eating like his steak like a proper gentleman. And like,
I mean, even through Dio's arrival, it's still brightly lit. That whole first episode is very brightly
for sure.
lit.
But except for those moments where we are looking at Dio's life before he goes to the Joestar mansion, where he's kind of playing chess in a pub to earn some extra cash and like getting his like face like slammed into the table because there's not much he can do about it. Like his dad's throwing like a bottle at his head. These scenes are very dark, very evocative of that first intro, that kind of looming specter of death. And it really gives you the idea that despite what Speedwagon says later, Speedwagon, I've watched so much JoJo where I can just say a name like that and not even bat an eye now. But despite what Speedwagon says later, you can really see how this sort of dark, like looming, dangerous environment like really shapes Dio into a way that certainly doesn't justify anything that he does, far from it, but does a great job of kind of making you understand his motivations, giving a why behind everything that he does. Even though it's bad, the logic is there, and it's all because of this kind of looming sense of danger, and what ends up triggering that transformation from this like seedy underbelly life to living the good life with the Joestars is a death. Both his father and his mother, but specifically after his mother dies, Dio poisons his father, and begins his like ambitious climb to be like the greatest. Doesn't want to be like stepped on by the rest of the world anymore, and that kind of powers him through the rest of this.
When he shows up, we still see a lot of his ambition at the Joestar Manor. We see him kind of start to subtly thwart Jojo in a lot of ways. However, there still is an element of sympathy is almost too strong of a word, but probably the best word for Dio, because he's a complete dick and he's a complete asshole, but with his backstory behind him, you kind of almost forgive him, especially because, and this is important, we don't know he poisoned his dad.
Yeah, that's a reveal that comes later. And I also want to add that the show inverts a bit what you'd expect, because with this sort of like class dynamic, Dio coming from a poor family and Jonathan coming from a rich one, it's usually reversed in that the poor character is kind of the underdog, and going up against like the big bad rich boy. So I've often heard fandom described as being a part where the Jojo isn't the main protagonist because he's not the one driving the action, because Dio is mostly driving the action. And I think you can't really make that claim when we spend like the entire middle part of the story without Dio, and coincidentally, like when Dio is not engaging in the story is where like it slows down the most. But I think you can certainly make that case for this first part, where we're getting a lot of interiority from Dio. We see him kind of concocting these schemes and like being like, all right, let's humiliate Jojo in this boxing match. It's not good enough that I beat him. I'm gonna like jam my thumb in his eye and like tell everyone else that these secret like boxing tricks, and that's gonna make Jojo like an outcast. So there is this weird element of kind of like protagonist sympathy of like Dio's the one with a goal, and he's the one kind of jumping around to try and accomplish that. And again, even though he's a dick, like Sean was saying, narratively, that kind of puts him in like a sympathetic light, you know?
Yeah, it does in a weird way. A lot of various elements of the plot really come together to create someone who you like despite like having no reason to. It's not even that he's an anti-hero, really. It's just that he gets this charisma later on that really explains it all away. But in the beginning, he doesn't really even have that. It's just well written, I guess, is honestly what we can say about it. It's well written, and you like it.
It's well written, and also I think this is where the adaptation helps a lot, because in the original Japanese with the subtitles, Takahito Koyasu's performance as Dio is wonderful. It's a great voice. Even like I could just listen to his voice all day, like without the subtitles, and it still sounds cool as fuck.
Yeah, he delivers every line with a sinister punch that is just immaculate. It's beautiful. Go on YouTube and go look up a Dio line. That's all you got to do. You'll understand exactly what we're talking about. It's a fantastic voice actor, and he does such great work. That being said, let's talk about where we start to lose sympathy for Dio, and our alliances shift more to our actual protag, Jojo. In that same first episode, after we've gone on this roller coaster ride of death to happiness to kind of liking Dio despite not feeling like we shouldn't, we get one final death. And this is basically the point in the show, on the first time I was watching it, where I stopped, took my headphones off, went, what the fuck, walked around the room for a couple seconds, sat back down, and finished the episode. Because pretty much, not necessarily apropos of nothing, but this is quite the escalation from the initial incident. Dio burns Jojo's dog alive. Like, he just puts him in a box, throws him in an incinerator, and burns him alive. And it is out of the blue, surprising, it is rough, and it immediately brings back that initial tone and just shows you that this show is, despite being kind of weirdly light-humored and bizarre, pun not intended, is gonna be fucking rough.
Yeah, Dio killing Danny is kind of a threshold cross in a lot of ways, because it's also, right before then, it's done as retaliation against Jojo, because this is the first time that Jojo has actually fought back. Before, when we see Dio and his schemes, I think part of what makes us attracted to him as a viewer is that, again, not only is he like the active participant, but Jonathan just sort of takes it. He just sort of like accepts his fate, and there's not much he can do about it. And that makes you feel bad for him. You don't dislike Jonathan, of course. But it adds some weight to kind of that whole like class perspective that Dio's coming from, of like, oh, like Jonathan's kind of the spoiled rich boy who doesn't know like anything about anything, and I come from this like rough, dark background, so I know what's best, and I'm going to show him up for it. So it's after that Dio messes with Jonathan's girlfriend that Jonathan finally fights back. And I mean, there's some not really related to death. There's some kind of weird gender stuff going on there. I mean, it is like the 1800s, so it's a bit it's not totally out of the blue.
It's not great, but it's also not something that I feel we're really well equipped to talk about.
No.
So
no.
Just take our word for it that it's a little problematic, and roll with it.
I would also like to add, far from the most problematic thing in JoJo. Speaking as someone who has seen and read most of it. And neither here nor there. But that's kind of Jonathan's motivation. Dio's messing with his girlfriend. He fights back, and that's where he kind of steps up, acts a little bit more noble instead of just kind of like cowering. And then, like, that's kind of the retaliation, is that Dio burns his dog alive. After that, the relationship sort of comes to, like, a cool, like, tension.
At this point, honestly, we kind of get to 2 episodes that are very, very good and very, very enjoyable. But the big takeaway, at least in terms of what we want to talk about is Robert E.O. Speedwagon, there's your dash of classic rock, comes into play as some thug in a back alley. Dio becomes a vampire. Yeah, it just happens. He puts on that stone mask from the beginning, gets a splash of blood, turns into this like all-powerful god-killing vampire thing, slaughters Jojo's dad, and puts him on the hero's quest to go kill Dio and do all that stuff. I don't think there's anything that crucial in those couple episodes that are really outstanding in terms of death. It's pretty standard hero's journey type of stuff.
I think the fact that Dio's transformation is triggered by the blood of Jonathan's father, I think is significant, but that's really the kind of thing that's only significant when you take into consideration the ending, which I kind of want to talk about later. So at this point, mostly the only thing I want to mention about this middle part is that it does a good job of paying off on that like kind of threat that we get at the beginning, that feeling of dread, that gothic feeling. That also comes back as a reminder, because I also think it's interesting that, you know, we get our whole intro episode with Jojo and Dio as kids, and when we cut to 7 years in the future, we don't cut to them. We cut to a scene of Jack the Ripper murdering someone. And part of that, I think, is just kind of like a sloppy-ish sort of way to re-emphasize the setting. But I also think, and the fact that Jack the Ripper will become a zombie minion who like jumps out of a horse, I guess, to set up that plot thread. But
yeah, that's the important stuff.
In JoJo, that is the important stuff. But in terms of tone, kind of working within like this rule of threes, you get that gothic feeling at the beginning, get kind of that reminder, this scene of grisly violence interrupting the childhood stuff and the college like unfoiling of Dio's plot. Because Jojo's dog, the other thing about that death scene is that a lot of JoJo is, of course, really over the top, and that includes the violence. Like in that scene where Dio becomes a vampire, a particularly memorable death is when he like swoops into the window and like brushes his hand against a guy's skull and like bisects it. And there's like blood everywhere. And so like the violence of the show is really over the top. And what makes that the death of his dog stand out so much is that we don't see it. We see him in the box and we see the furnace go on. And then it's just sort of like left weirdly understated by JoJo standards, just as like the butler hears something scratching in the box, you hear the dog like start to whine as it heats up, and it's very brutal in its own way, but not in sort of the outright gothic horror vibe that the whole show is going to go on with from this point forward. So
I think it works as a segue, though, into the kind of cooled down tension that follows in the next episode. Because if it was the visceral death that we see later on and we see before and whatnot, I feel like that would imply a more explosive follow-up. And we don't get that. The next episode does open in a, at least between the two of them, as you said, cooled down way. So it kind of signifies especially because even compared to the other acts that Dio has done, it is much less showy as far as how the show presents it. So it works as a cool down before we get to the next scene.
Totally agreed. But I was just saying that after the show, as a contrast to that death, then uses that jump forward in time. Again, just to serve as kind of a reminder, because because with the cooldown that comes with the aftermath of Danny burning might create the expectation that the show will sort of keep at that level, that more like understated level, and then but I think just to remind us that, or at least plant that expectation that things are going to get crazy again. Like, that's the purpose of the Jack the Ripper scene, I think, which of course is the...
No, absolutely. And I'm not, like, trying to argue that against you. I'm more so just saying that I feel that the dog's or Danny's death being understated wasn't that weird, especially the contrast with the Jack the Ripper scene isn't that weird, because Jack the Ripper and that whole segment is so separate from what is happening with Jojo, not only in location, not only in visceralness, but also, like, there's a time difference. Everything in Jojo up to that point has been in the day. The only deaths that have really occurred outside of Danny have been at night. It is a different tone of just the general lighting. It's a much darker look. I mean, obviously it's night, but it still keeps that idea that these are separate events. And yes, at some point they may merge. It neither of them felt that weird or out of place to me. They worked unto what they were trying to do.
Totally.
With kind of Dio's transformation at this point, we fall into what is essentially the second act of Phantom Blood. The big thing that kind of jumped out to me in this second act is the introduction of zombies. And if you've listened to our episode on George Romero and his work with zombies and what he did for the whole genre as a whole, you know that we have a lot of feelings. I think that this set of zombies is kind of interesting, largely because it reverts to the pre-Romero zombie of creatures that still have their sentience and they are slaves to a master, but they still have mobility, they still have cognitive reasoning, much more of the old brainwash zombies of closer to the Victorian era, actually, than the modern ideology of zombies, which are slow, shambling hordes. I thought that was kind of cool, and I like that they were still identified as zombies despite that. It kind of worked for me in a weird way, just that I was expecting when they're like, oh, you've got zombies now, for this to turn into a weirdly zombie Resident Evil style thing, and it didn't. It turned into the classic zombies, which was cool, and I dug.
Well, the other thing that's cool about them being identified as zombies, and I think one of the reasons why they are identified as such is because you can also make the argument that they also act a lot more like vampires than what we think of as zombies, which is, you know, they're turned by a vampire who, Dio, so that'd be appropriate. But I think what also identifying them as zombies, like specifically as minions...
Is it the yellow skin and goggles?
The yellow skin and goggles?
Yeah, as minions.
Oh, no. How dare you? Oh, God. All right. I'm going to leave you to wallow in your shame on that one.
All right, thank you for listening to this episode. This has been Phantom Blood. I guess we're never having another episode, so we'll talk to you.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the last podcast, guys. I'm going to go throw Sean into a ditch. Anyway. So, but by keeping the minions identified as zombies, it helps keep Dio as kind of like the special guy, the boss, you know, like these are just sort of the zombies, but Dio, like, he's a vampire. Like, that means that he can freeze his skin, he can do all this, like, blood-sucking shit with, like, all sorts of appendages. Like, Dio can regenerate, do all these things that zombies can't.
But that's not entirely true, because the first zombie we see, thank you, Jack the Ripper, can sprout knives from his body. So that's a neat little power. We get Blue Ford, who can suck blood through his hair. They have powers still, is what I'm getting at here. The only thing that Dio really has that they don't have, other than a multitude of powers, is regeneration.
That's true. That's a good point. And let's not forget my favorite character in the entire show, the dreaded Doobie, who can use snakes, like snake venom from his face. That's also true, but I think by identifying these characters as zombies, it still creates that hierarchy, where even though like Dio gets like the magnitude of these powers as well, everyone else may have one or two like neat tricks they can do and have just increased strength and vulnerability to sunlight. It still, I think, gives Dio a special place in the story that may have been undercut a little bit. Like if they had been identified as vampires, like Dio is creating more vampires, makes him a little less special. And we want Dio to be special because he's our special bad boy.
That is true, honestly. It does. You still get an idea that zombies are below the vampire idea. I just like that it's not your standard conventional zombie, but it still is an old idea of a zombie, and I really dig that.
Going along with the whole idea of that being an older idea, I think Phantom Blood does a good job of really creating that feel of an older story, of an old, like, 19th century, like, kind of gothic horror story, while still putting its weird anime twist on it. Like, if you look at what happens in the story and just kind of describe it, like, you could rewrite this story in, like, flowery prose and, you know, call it, like, a old, like, one of, and it'd sound like one of those early, like, horror novels, one of those early, like, science fiction novels. And I think it's cool that despite a lot of the anachronistic stuff, a lot of the classical rock references, and just in general, a lot of the over-the-top stuff, in terms of carrying that tone, I think it does a really good job, and I think drawing from those older ideas of zombies is something that really helps with that feeling, and helps distinguish it not just from other anime, but also from, like, the other parts going forward. Like, every JoJo part has a very particular feel to it, and despite this being kind of the beginning of the saga, it's no exception, because it's really leaning into that period piece feeling.
Along the same lines of that kind of gothic horror, let's talk about the big death in this scene, which is a personal favorite death of mine in this first arc, and I know you're a big fan of it as well. There is a scene that does a both really great job of characterizing Dio and really unsettling in a lot of ways. Dio has been slowly taking over this town the whole time, and he has captured this woman and her child. She is begging for the life of her child. She is offering to sacrifice herself to Dio, to his undead hordes, so long as the child can go free. Dio says, "Sure, I'll do this for you. You will become amongst my undead hordes, and we promise you that myself nor my horde will touch your child." He turns her, and she looks at her child and basically says, "Looks good," and chows down.
So wonderfully brutal. I love it so much.
It is rough. It is so good.
Yeah, and I think because there's another key element that I wanted to add to your description, is that not only does Dio agree, he says, like, you know, okay, like, I promise, like, my zombies, me, we're not gonna touch your kid. He kind of asks her, like, are you sure? Like, you know, I could give your child, like, eternal life, is what you could be with your child forever, and there'd be no problems, you'd be together forever. You really want to do this? And I think it's that little extra detail that really makes it such a good scene, just because it shows that despite being, like, kind of a mustache twirler, like a real, like, over-the-top ham, like, evil overlord, Dio's, like, weirdly got some standards, and that there's even, like, he's still, like, a smug, like, piece of shit afterwards when he's like, I told you, like, I warned you that, you know, you should have taken my offer, but, like, it feels, it shows that in his own, like, fucked up little world, that's his, like, way of offering mercy, and it's still terrible, but it's such a specific little detail, that
it does a lovely job of characterization.
Yeah.
It gives such an idea on who Dio is in this instant, who he becomes when he has unlimited power and what he can do with it. It really elevates him from a, I don't want to say B-grade villain, but more so just like your standard villain to a villain that has charisma out the ass and is willing to bend the rules and play with expectations and just amuse himself in a way. It's charismatically evil, and what really elevates him to a great villain.
Yeah, and there's kind of that element of the classic vampire, that seductive element to it too, because of how he always phrases it. Especially, there are other instances too when he's talking about making someone one of the undead. Like, he will usually phrase it, spin it in a way that sounds more positive, like living like an eternal life or something along those lines. And it really shows you, even though he has rejected his humanity, as he says when he's putting on the mask, that's still what he values. And again, there's something charismatic, and just like listening to him talk, like he sounds almost reasonable, and really is just like kind of how the zombies are kind of the pinnacle of this old idea of like gothic horror and science fiction. Like, Dio is just a wonderfully classic vampire, and everything that sort of entails, and he just also happens to be one that can do weird anime stuff like shoot lasers out of his eyes.
It is the weirdest blending of two sources, and it does it in a glorious, glorious way that just causes you to almost instantly fall in love with this villain as soon as he does it. It, as I said, it really, really elevates him from one point to another. It's great.
And weirdly, like, thinking about this idea of like Dio being the protagonist of Phantom Blood more than Jonathan, again, Jonathan gets so much screen time that you can't really make that case. But Dio certainly, you watch him grow as an evil overlord, like, weirdly enough. In the scene before this, where he's facing off with Jonathan as a vampire for the first time after the mansion burns down, he's doing a lot of preening, like a lot of hammy, like shouting, and it'll come back to that. But also, this is kind of showing us the other side of that coin as he kind of continues to toy with his powers and really, really see what he can do. Dio's fun because it feels like he really wants to experiment with his new powers. And I know, like, it's really silly that Dio has like manimals in his castle, like a man with like a cat head.
Those were so fucking creepy.
Those were creepy and also weirdly hilarious. But it shows that, like, that's also a pretty good bit of characterization, just as like someone who's gained all this power and is just like, what if I can create zombies? What if I put this man's head on a cat? Like, can I do that? Like, that's the kind of person that Dio is, and it's great.
Yeah. I have nothing else to add. That is great. It's fucking weird. It's incredible.
So, before we move into the finale, I wanted to talk a little bit about what doesn't work so well for me in this part, because again, like I mentioned, you do see some growing pains as he tries to figure out how to write an interesting story, like really make the most out of his ideas. And too often, I think the biggest problem with Phantom Blood is that it follows not necessarily the tropes of like Victorian, like gothic horror, like we were talking about, but when it follows just kind of your standard like shonen hero's journey adventure tropes. And I think sort of the biggest problem in that regard is the character of Zeppeli, who pretty much only exists to serve as this mentor figure in like a very classic like Obi-Wan Yoda kind of way. He doesn't even get much intro. He just kind of shows up and punches Jonathan, and suddenly Jonathan can do magical sun powers, which is a lot less interesting, I would like to add, than what his grandson Joseph ends up doing with those same powers, and B, the sequence in the mansion where Jonathan had to like think on his feet and like set traps to like try and keep Dio at bay. So we kind of get this arc of like Zeppeli trying to teach Jonathan about Haman through all this stuff that's like typical like kooky like training stuff. And in the Jack the Ripper scene, he wants Jonathan to kill him without spilling a drop of wine, like that kind of like test. And we get to the big scene where we find out that there's some sort of like prophecy that Zeppeli is fated to die to rescue Jonathan. And then he does, and it's brutal. Like, he gets pretty much cut in half, but then that's kind of it. And the moment for me just sort of lands with a big thud, just because it's so clearly, like I said, clearly playing from the Obi-Wan playbook of, oh, the mentor character's got to die at some point, because, you know, that's what they do, right?
Zeppeli gives Jojo his powers in doing so, and essentially fulfills the strike me down and I shall become twice as powerful. And he gets cut in half. You know who else gets cut in half? Obi-Wan. You know who ends up with twice as much power? Luke / Jojo. You know it's the exact same thing? This.
And it's a little disappointing just because the setup for that fight is like a little bit fun, a little bit interesting.
Oh my god, it's great. I love it.
Yeah, you have the big dude on the chain and Jojo. It's a real classic. That's one of the areas where you can see like Araki starting to develop his fighting style. That's the kind of thing that sort of setup is going to come back a lot later in like Stardust and Battle Tendency. And the fact that it just gets resolved with that kind of fun setup, that it just gets resolved with, you know, Jojo basically getting a Super Saiyan power-up from this mentor character that we don't really care about. Like, there are some fun characters in Phantom Blood. I think Jojo and Dio, I think they have, like, an excellent, even though on their own they're not necessarily the most, like, deep characters. I think they've got, like, a great, interesting relationship. They've got a fun dynamic. Jojo's likable in his own right. Dio is such a charismatic villain. Speedwagon's just a lovable little scamp. He just takes he's just so afraid and takes everything so seriously. You can't help but smile at him. But then you get Zeppeli.
Don't forget Poco.
Oh, we can't I actually totally forgot that Poco existed when I was watching this again. Even though that's like how that fight gets resolved, like the child like slips through the window. It's like, who cares?
So, fun fact, just to kind of lay into Poco. Apparently, Poco's a band. Like,
I shouldn't be surprised, but you know.
No, I know, but the fact that we can't remember Poco, and I have never heard of Poco the band, is kind of perfect in a bad way.
Yeah, that's about right. Point is, outside of Jonathan and Dio, and you know, and Speedwagon, I'll throw Speedwagon in there. I mean, there's a reason that Speedwagon gets a big part in part 2. Like really, we don't have much in the way of fun, memorable characters, and I think there are some other problems I have with this middle portion, but the biggest one is that after kind of the craziness of that escalation from the Victorian drama to the gothic vampire like battle manga, we end up leaning too hard into the adventure. They don't really visit any interesting sites. It's basically they just keep going forward until we hit Dio's castle, and along the way we'll have some power-ups. The mentor will pass his strength. And then, you know, we'll take a nap while that's happening, and then, you know, wake up in time for Dio to start preening and having a fun time again.
I was honestly really hoping that Dio's castle would be very Castlevania-esque, because it looks like Castlevania, and it would have been a lot of fun to see Jojo in Castlevania. But alas and alack, he just shows up at the top, and there's Dio, and they fight.
Yeah, that's so weird that we don't get an episode like about like navigating the traps of the castle. You feel like, I mean, I guess that's what like the whole like Bluford and Tarkus sequence is supposed to convey, but like that wasn't the same castle. It's just strange that he just sort of arrived. So, and I also noticed, I think part of this is just how, again, he's sort of developing as a writer. But particularly compared, you know, you can't help but think of Dio. And when I think of Dio now, I inevitably think about the fight with Dio in Stardust Crusaders, which is my favorite battle in like all of anime, like period. I think. I love that fight. So obviously, when I'm paying pretty close attention to when Jonathan and Dio are fighting, and it's weirdly like underdeveloped and anticlimactic. And at first, I was just kind of disappointed that we don't get like this cool sequence like we get at the end of part 3. But I also think that's a little bit on purpose, because when we get to the last episode, we get a bit more of a satisfying payoff. And even as of the end of like the confrontation of Dio's castle, we know that Dio's still alive. His weirdly racist zombie minion comes and gathers his head from the rubble and scurries off with him. And there's even throughout the build up of the final episode of Jonathan and Erina like going off to their honeymoon. There's again this really explicit build up of tension of. We hear Dio make his famous, like, "ree" sound effect in the coffin as the men carry it into the hull of the ship. We know he's still out there, and we know things are about to go bad. And then we get a final confrontation that I think pays off really well on Jonathan and Dio's strange but kind of interesting relationship where they come to have, like, a mutual respect for one another before, of course... our protagonist Jonathan Joestar is killed. Too good for this sinful earth. And that's kind of what I wanted to spend the last bit of this episode talking about, without getting too much into the spoilers for future parts. On the rewatch, I was looking really closely for maybe, I don't know if foreshadowing is the right word, but kind of thematic resonance, knowing that this is where we're going to end up, that our good boy Jonathan is going to die. And I think it's particularly noteworthy because, you know, I keep emphasizing what a good boy Jonathan is. And part of that is because that's what makes him stand out from all the other JoJos so much. Jonathan's really noble. Jonathan's really honorable, really sweet guy. Even like he still finds like tears to shed for Dio, who like ruined his life, like as he thinks he's killing him. And he's just a stand-up gentleman. And every other JoJo after him, and this is like an explicit contrast with part 2 particularly, is not that. They are some sort of scoundrel, thug. Part 5's JoJo is literally a mobster. Even the second nicest JoJo, part 4's Josuke probably, is still like a bit of a schemer. Still like kind of gets into fights with people because he's too hot-headed. Still like it makes some over the top like brutal judgments on his enemies. So I was sort of looking for that thematic connection, and maybe I'm asking for too much, because the reality of how this kind of manga is written doesn't play well into doing a broad story arc. Araki's got to think of stuff to put in week for week. It's kind of why we move into the Monster of the Week battles from part 3 onwards, and it's hard to do, kind of put that foreshadowing when you're working your ass off trying to make something interesting for people to read every week. And so part of me at first was maybe a little disappointed that we don't get that moment, because the other notable thing about Jonathan is that, again, without getting too much into spoilers, like, Jonathan pretty much totally fails at everything he set out to do. And without commenting on, like, how successful each of his various descendants are in the course of the plot, like, Jonathan just doesn't get the job done. So it's the kind of thing that makes you wonder, like, what is it about Jonathan that hinders him versus his descendants, who are maybe a little more ruthless, a little more willing to play dirty. And so I was kind of looking for that moment where Jonathan's fate is kind of sealed because of that naivety, because of that dedication to honor. But you never really get it. I was looking for maybe a moment on the boat where he finds a chance to escape, but maybe ends up taking, like, a bad hit because of trying to save, like, a civilian or Erina or somebody. But that doesn't really happen. He just sort of gets, like, blasted by Dio. And it's not even, like, a situation where he went easy on Dio and let him go. Like, he thought Dio was pretty dead. Dio only got out of his predicament because he had the idea of severing his head before the Haman ate the rest of his body. So, that left me a little bit unsatisfied, just because I think as far as, like, a broader arc, that could be a really interesting thing to explore. But what I did think about on a second watch was the role that Jonathan's father played in all this, and specifically the detail that his blood, it's called phantom blood for a reason, is what triggers Dio's transformation and sets the whole, like, sorry history of the Joestars in motion. And funnily enough, that's kind of where I do get my moment, because we get a scene with George, with Jonathan's father, where he is being called into the police station because they caught Dio's father trying to pawn off his engagement ring or his wedding ring, and they know that it's stolen. And George chooses to let him go, telling him to walk, like, an honorable path, and still keeps his promise to pay a debt that he doesn't really owe to Dio's dad, just because it's the honorable thing to do. And his choice to house Dio, that maybe stupid, maybe naive choice, is what sets the whole plot in motion, including his son's death. So if you're looking at it from the lineage perspective, it's sort of interesting in that how that naivete is what basically ruins the Joestar family, or sets them down this, like, path of strife and struggle, but it's also what makes Jonathan such a noble character, and also kind of what the other characters, through their heroic exploits, are trying to live up to in a way. He becomes a sort of martyr at the end of that scene. I don't know, I just think it's a super interesting ending when you're considering the broad arc of it, especially considering that at the time, for that kind of shonen series, like, killing off your main character was apparently really taboo. Like, the reason every JoJo has a really, like, distinct design, except for Joseph, who looks exactly like Jonathan, and that's because the editors were afraid of what would happen if the readers of Phantom Blood went to Battle Tendency and couldn't find that identifiable link back to the main character of the first part. So yeah, I kind of just rambled on there a lot. Sorry.
I honestly don't have much to add to that. I'm not nearly as invested in the later JoJo series as you are. I figure you have way more to say, and it would be way more coherent if I just let you explain what you need to say.
Totally fair.
But before we let you go on another rant, we're going to wrap this episode up. I've been Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. I also stream on Twitch every Tuesday and Sunday at 8 o'clock. I am twitch.tv/helpless_Skippy.
And I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me on Twitter at JacksonJKeller. I talk about JoJo a lot on Twitter, actually. I've been reading through the other parts and kind of live tweeting my impressions of them. So if you want to know why I don't really like Part 5, that's a good place to look.
If you want more news about the podcast, you should follow us on Twitter at BADH_cast. We'd like to give a usual special thank you to Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide alternate take off the album High Octane Low Expectations.
And I have a special request for all you JoJo fans out there. So we are planning to do at least one more episode, mostly to please me, about Battle Tendency, because I think it pairs really well with Phantom Blood. The contrasts are very specific there. So we are going to do one more JoJo episode. If you are a JoJo fan and you would like to see us do more JoJo, please leave a comment. Please tell us, what your favorite part is, what other interesting things you would like to add. Just because the more demand there is for JoJo discussions, the more I can convince Sean to watch the rest of it and give you guys sweet, sweet JoJo content. So, leave a comment. Have a great time.
Second announcement. Starting next week, we are moving the release date back one day, and we're going to be releasing on Thursdays. What this does mean, though, is that we'll be recording earlier than we used to be. So as opposed to having like a week and a half wait between a movie coming out and us getting a podcast out, we should have it within 6 or so days. So you will have a hotter take than a lukewarm take.
A bathwater take.
That being said, next week we will be talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey, a wild contrast from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. With that, though, we're going to leave you with a smash cut of some of our favorite JoJo lines, because let me tell you, there's a lot. So please, enjoy.
I present unto you Doobie.
That crazy blight is inside our horse!
Lifting this rock is nothing.
That's incredible!
I sent my Hamon coursing harmlessly through Froggy to split my real target, the rock below.
The name is Robert E.O. Speedwagon.
Baron Zeppeli, at your service. Master Tonpetty.
I'm known as Dyer.
Hello, my name is Straitzo.
Now then, Father Sticks.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go